Welcome to Here and Now. I'm Beth Lamont. We have a series on global climate change, and here's another exciting episode. Please stay tuned and enjoy.
Hi, I'm Steve James. This is our show on global climate change. We have with us Jerry S. Piven, PhD. Dr. Piven has taught at NYU, New School University, Case Western Reserve University, where his courses have focused on the philosophy of religion, existentialism, psychoanalysis, and metaphysics. He has earned interdisciplinary graduate degrees in the fields of psychology, religion, philosophy, and literature, and has studied at the National Psychological Association for Psychoanalysis Training Institute. He is the editor of several books and author of several others, including Death and Delusion, A Freudian Analysis of Mortal Terror. He has recently completed Slaughtering Death on the Psychoanalysis of Terror, Religion, and Violence. Jerry, welcome to the show. Nice to see you again.
Thank you for having me.
Great. Jerry, the vast majority of scientists concur that we are facing a global catastrophe. Yet, it's not as though the information is a secret. It's been out for quite some time. And yet, so many people are doing nothing or very little. They're certainly not forcing their government to do something. Why do so many seem to refuse to accept it or care? How do you explain the seeming apathy so many people have toward these dire concerns?
Well, there are many possible answers to this, and I don't want to overgeneralize with any particular explanation. Some might suggest that human beings are only capable of focusing on a specific number of stimuli at any given time. As Becker says, people bite out a manageable piece of the world for themselves.
And that's Ernest Becker?
Yes, Ernest Becker, author of The Denial of Death. We can only focus on so much at any given time. We have these narrow world views in which we focus on our immediate concerns, our own priorities, our own crises, et cetera, and we just can't tolerate the flux of information and the chaos, et cetera. That's one explanation. Another explanation may be more sociological, may have to do with the values inculcated by society, parents, educational system, et cetera. And while those have merit, I think to be psychological means we have to start asking different kinds of questions about how people are feeling, what their processes are in terms of dealing with this kind of information, because we're not just dealing with something which is a minor fact about maybe something happening somewhere across the world that's nebulous, as you even asked me. Mm-hmm. This is something that has been really considered a world crisis for some time. So the question is, as you asked, how could we ignore something that is becoming a virulent problem? And
when you say we, I mean, there are certainly a number of people who recognize that it's a crisis and
indeed,
they're concerned.
Indeed. And many people are devoting their lives to changing things and really are persevering in this regard. But there are so many of us who only make token gestures, and so many of us who know that it's happening and maybe we don't do anything about it. And the question is, well, how could we live our lives without taking this seriously? If, as you say, the oceans are potentially rising dramatically, icebergs are disappearing permanently, we're seeing the climate changes around us. It's possible to ignore that kind of stuff if we're going about our lives, but why aren't we a little bit more panicked about it? You'd think that this kind of stuff would arouse more panic, and that's why I'd add a certain kind of psychological dimension to it. Now, let me bring in a few examples of something that tells me that maybe there is a psychological dimension, and it's not just a matter of people going about their lives and trying to pay their rent and accomplish whatever they need to get along, but that it might be more than just that. When I was at Case Western, I would often ask my students questions about the world, about ethics, about moral responsibility, and I'd say to them, if you had to pay 10 cents more for a banana, that was organic and not just for health reasons, but because you were not funding drug lords, and by paying that extra 10 cents, you could stop some amount of deforestation. Isn't it worth the 10 cents extra not to destroy the rainforest? And they'd say, well, yeah, obviously it is. But when I'd ask questions like that, and I'd say, why aren't you thinking about this stuff? They'd say, well, because it's too depressing. And I'd say, really, it's when you see bananas, you're confronted with some sort of moral dilemma, an existential crisis of such epic proportions that you have to ignore it completely and then go buy the deforestation bananas, because otherwise you will deliquesce into some sort of depressive state where you can't function. Well, that doesn't seem particularly reasonable and realistic. And I'd say to them, really, you can't deal with any more pain than that? And they knew it was funny when we'd have these conversations. But the answer that I'd receive all the time was, I can't think about these things too much because they're too upsetting. And so I'd have to try to provide them with a little bit more of an existential perspective and encourage them to make this a part of their lives. And I'd ask them, what is your moral responsibility to the planet? Isn't it worth it just to pay a little bit of attention? Maybe pay the extra 10 cents. Maybe with the next time you're going to buy something, you say, maybe that mahogany is from Indonesia, harvested illegally, and I don't have to have it. I don't have to have this piece of furniture, or I don't have to buy something that I know is exploiting people or destroying the environment and so forth. Why is it so hard for us to make even little changes like that?
And what's wrong with being upset once in a while?
Indeed, and I would ask them, are you so incapable of tolerating that kind of pain? In fact, don't you want to experience a certain amount of pain? What does it take for you to get upset about something? When I would have my students read Walter Davis's book, Death's Dream Kingdom, which is a really bizarre and provocative and fascinating and upsetting book, one thing that they would say, and I encourage anybody to go read this because Walter Davis is a tremendous writer and really, really fascinating. They'd say, he seems really upset. He seems really angry. And I'd say, well, what's wrong with that? They'd say, well, that would undermine his objectivity and his scholarliness and so forth. And I'd say, yeah, earlier in his career when he was playing by the rules, he would be dispassionate. But let me ask you this. He's talking about how our government might be using depleted uranium shells on civilians, irradiating the planet for generations. He's talking about deforestation. He's talking about destroying the world. He's talking about 1 million civilian casualties of illegal war. Do you think the appropriate attitude toward that is actually dispassion? He's angry because it needs to be said, and because the apathy that people are expressing seems so painfully inappropriate.
Misplaced.
He's jumping up and down saying, what do I have to do to get you to jump up and down and scream with me? This cannot be allowed to happen. How many civilians have to be killed? How much of the planet has to be destroyed before you think that this is something important enough to take notice of?
So what does this have to do with Ernest Becker?
Well, what it has to do with is we're talking about the psychological motives for a kind of apathy or obliviousness. And we find this kind of obliviousness around us everywhere. Now, I'm not saying it's the same with every person or every culture or even every subculture or any city in America. I can't assume that what I see happening in America or in New York is the same as it is anywhere else. But around here, you see people walking around their cell phones, walking through busy intersections in Times Square, glued to their amniotic devices.
It's amazing that they're not all killed.
Indeed, many of them do get into accidents, but the hypnotoad-like pull of the devices entrance them, and there is this kind of weird self-absorption that seems to preoccupy us. And if we invoke certain kinds of psychoanalytic or psychological approaches, such as those represented by people like Becker, we'll find maybe there's something going on in terms of the way this oblivion or self-absorption is a defense on some level. It's not just that we don't give a damn or that we don't care about anybody else. We love to care. It's just that we love to care, but only so much because maybe we're incredibly in some ways narcissistic. And by narcissistic, I don't just mean conceited, I mean preoccupied with self and ego gratification as a way of distancing ourselves from pain, distancing ourselves from the tragic. There was an interview a few years ago with my cousin where somebody talked to him about tragic theater, and he said, yeah, tragic theater is great. You could really get into it. And it's like, no, well, yeah, tragic theater is great. It is fantastic, but we're not ready for that. We like happy endings. We like anodynes and soothing bromides, and to an extent, we might consider the possibility
comedy,
that we're really fleeing terribly from some dark abyss of potential horror. If we had to confront the possibilities of what's going to happen to our planet and our children and so forth, it would be really upsetting and bleak in many ways. So, aside from the other possible explanations in terms of enculturation and so forth, in terms of eliminating certain kinds of stimuli, there's also the possibility that we are really horrified on some level of the kind of bleak vision of catastrophe that may really be so imminent. And we're warding this off. I mean, narcissism can be a defense against death. Self-preoccupation could be a defense against pain and horror. And so we're no longer in the realm of people just not caring as though they lack empathy, but we're in the realm of a kind of register of the psyche where people are defending themselves really, really stringently against the kinds of horrors that might impinge upon that ego gratification.
So we're talking about what Ernest Becker called the denial of death.
Indeed, and when we talk about the denial of death, of course, we're not just speaking of death as the end of life, one fixed concept of termination, but death as in annihilation, death as in a horrible future for us, for the planet, destruction of nature, destruction of self-identity, the potential for happiness. Death can mean many, many things. And it's that kind of fear of some sort of annihilating future, an annihilation of possibility, the obliteration of everything that one sees as existing right now.
The end of the species.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You'd think that this is precisely the kind of thing that would horrify people enough to pay attention, but it is precisely that kind of horror which motivates the oblivion and the self-preoccupation and the need for gratification right now.
Jerry, thank you for a fascinating conversation. You're going to stick with us, right? Great. We're going to take a little break. We'll be back in a minute.
Here and Now is produced by the Humanist Society of Metropolitan New York, the Corliss Lamont chapter of the American Humanist Association. Please visit our website.
We're here with Dr. Jerry Piven talking about global climate change. Jerry, fascinating conversation about Americans and their apathy. Is it just us here in the US? How do cultures around the world deal with global climate change?
Okay, well, again, we're not going to overgeneralize because there are clearly lots of people who think that this is an immense crisis that we have to deal with, and they're preoccupied with it. But there's a spectrum of responses to this, from real intense devotion to token devotion, where we could go green and wear our wristbands and maybe drive a Prius and be a little bit conceited and self-congratulatory about what we're doing, and maybe not really do all that much else, maybe not really look into where the batteries for the Prius may come from, because it requires us to pay too much attention and potentially take moral responsibility for not doing enough. And I've known plenty of people who really do genuinely care about the environment, but when it comes time for them to make certain sacrifices or to really look into it or open themselves up to the pain of that kind of helplessness or that dismal vision, they step back, they dissociate that kind of stuff from their daily lives because it's just too difficult for some people. So I don't want to claim that there's only one American response to this, but again, we have that spectrum from immense devotion to utter narcissism and obliviousness. What might be a little bit more unusual elsewhere is that degree of apathy we were talking about earlier. And in a sense, how strangely preoccupied, self-centered, and exploitative we can be. Now, I can't say that this is a general phenomenon even across America, but if you're living in New York or New Jersey, it seems like the moral compass of many people on the streets it really goes no further than what tends to piss them off at any given moment, and the response to some sort of conflict is often you or something like this. And I'm thinking of a friend of mine from my cycling club, from the New York Cycle Club, Richard Rosenthal. He's the only guy in the club that I know who is really, really devoted to ethical issues, and people think that he is a crackpot. They think he's a curmudgeonly, old, annoying, obnoxious guy, and he loves to actually say that about himself as well. But their reaction to him is, what is all the fuss? Why do we care about this stuff? And his response is similar to Walter Davis, which is, why aren't you jumping up and down and screaming about this stuff? From the perspective of many other cultures with access to this, they look at America and they say, how could you be so infantile? How could you be so self-absorbed? How could you drive such massive, gargantuan tanks down your streets and guzzle gas and destroy the environment and take this stuff for granted? Now, that doesn't mean that every other culture, by comparison, is obsessed with the environment, but it does mean that there is a particular character to our conspicuous consumption, conspicuous leisure, conspicuous exploitation.
And conspicuous denial.
And indeed, conspicuous denial.
So does this have to do with the resurgence of American religiosity, of fundamentalism in the U.S.? Is it religious beliefs that are bringing people to deny what the scientific community is telling us?
Well, for some people, I would imagine it has to. For the vast majority of Americans who are self-preoccupied and drive their gas-guzzling cars and so forth, it isn't necessarily a religious dimension. There are clearly people in America who have a fundamentalist belief that they are entitled to exploit the world. There are the Dominion theologists who think that they can destroy the world and actually hasten the apocalypse and the resurrection. There are plenty of people who think that, regardless of whatever their affiliation might be, that the planet has been bequeathed to them by God, and so it is theirs to exploit. But then there are also people, really, I don't know how prevalent those people are. They exist, but they aren't the huge swathes of people who are that consumptive. Again, I was talking to a physical therapist a few weeks ago as I was working through a cycling injury, and we were talking about the environment. And she said, "Oh, I went on vacation. There are plenty of trees. I don't know what you environmentalist types are talking about."
But certainly there are corporate interests that think that the world is there to be exploited.
There are corporate interests, there are religious interests, there are all sorts of interests that want to exploit the world, and some would claim that it's just a matter of being very predatory and that it's a matter of them focusing on money and gratification. And, yeah, there is that, but then there's also the question of why isn't that exploitativeness and that predatory attitude toward the environment mitigated by some sort of empathy or horror for what they're doing? Why is there no moral responsibility? Why don't they care? And when there's that degree of a lack of empathy, when you see that you're destroying and despoiling the world, one again starts to become psychological and ask, what has to happen for people to, for them to be immune to any kind of feeling of shame or guilt or horror at what they're doing or what they're allowing themselves to.
Now, some of us certainly accept the notion that global climate change is real. And yet, even those of us who intellectually know and understand it seem to be in denial. I, for example, drove here in a gasoline-powered car. I heat my home with oil. Is it possible that you can know something intellectually and yet still deny it somehow?
Well, yes, yeah, of course you can. Now, first of all, I mean, these are really two questions. One is, are we doing enough, and can we do more? And the answer is, well, yeah, obviously, because I've ridden my bicycle from New York City to Westport. It's possible to commute. I'm not saying you should with a lot of camera equipment. I'm just saying that many of us are really self-indulgent and to some degree lazy, and we love our luxuries. Can we do without some of those luxuries? Not all, but some. Yes, we could do a hell of a lot more. Another issue is, what do we really want? What are we trying to accomplish with our lives? And can we be in denial while simultaneously having the fantasy that we're really doing something? Well, yes, because intellectualization itself can be a defense. People can intellectualize things in order not to cope with them emotionally. And so you'll find a lot of people talking, for example, when they talk about Becker's book, The Denial of Death, they'll say, I don't understand what the big deal is. I'm not afraid of death. What's the problem? Just get over it, right? In fact, the philosophical tradition is one of rationalizing one's way out of death. Once one realizes that once one is not going to be there to suffer, once one is dead, once one realizes this, one realizes there's nothing to fear from death. So philosophers, since Socrates onward, Socrates through Montaigne, through even some of the more famous and brilliant philosophers today, will say that you can use your rational thought process to disempower the dread of death. But intellectualization can be a way of not contending with the kinds of pain and fear, the terror that lurk within, and I would argue move us in ways that we're unaware of.
So we've been taking a psychological approach to these concerns. Can we talk a little bit about what motivates us? What compels us to consume and destroy the planet that is our home?
Well, again, there can be a plethora of motives here. And some of it, again, may be a kind of stunted empathy that comes from the kind of lives some people have led in terms of what happened to them in childhood, in terms of their personal struggles and that kind of hardness, that kind of cold, almost schizoid rage against anything that feels or is vulnerable. There are people, I think Avatar, actually, that film, which I don't love, but is fascinating in this regard, can show the kind of the not only the hunger to exploit, but the rage against anything that's living and vulnerable. And what do they call bleeding heart liberals? This is the accusation against anybody who cares about this sort of stuff. There can be a kind of counterphobic defense against death that manifests itself in hatred toward that which is vulnerable. And so there are those who exploit the world not only because they can profit from it, but there's also that edge of contempt. That edge of disparagement, that edge of, yes, we are going to take this and destroy it and uproot it and consume it, and it will be ours. And the people who are there now, the people, the animals, the planet itself, that stuff is ripe for the destruction. So now we're getting into not only a lack of empathy, but a kind of biting hostility, malevolence.
We're talking about what's underneath the surface of
well,
a
sometimes
culture.
It's actually on the surface,
Sometimes
but the question is, why do people get that way? And that's difficult to answer. How do people get into such a state where they feel contempt toward that which is vulnerable or natural, where they find that people who lament this problem are whiners, where it's a kind of a effeminate, contemptible thing when we care about the planet or care about the suffering of others. Okay? And so I would suggest, I mean, among the possible motives, there can be those who fight against the possibility of death, fight against the possibility of emotional annihilation, fight against the possibility of their own vulnerability, their own weakness, by taking that out, by inflicting that kind of vulnerability on others.
It's an American toughness, American ruggedness.
Well, okay, let's assume for the sake of argument that there can be a virtue to certain forms of ruggedness in the frontier and in life, and we appreciate those who don't depend on others and who are willing to accept challenges, yeah. But then there are also those who see masculinity and toughness and strength and exploitation and aggression as a kind of denial of being a kind of effeminate wussy. The kind of rejection of being weak and vulnerable, and that they have a contempt for anything that really is, in any sense, feeling deep emotion or that has needs. And you'll find, I think, when you talk to people who have contempt for the needy, who have contempt for the homeless, who have contempt for animals, who have contempt for the liberals, who have contempt for the planet, that when they hate the whininess of it, when they hate the softness of it all, they're reacting to this utter dread of being weak and helpless and vulnerable, and they recoil against it allergically. Their gorge rises at it, and they wish to crush it out. And so I'm suggesting that among the many motives, there can be many more that have to do with the incredible kinds of terrors that lurk within. And here I would quote Walter Davis again, who doesn't suggest that death motivates all our behavior, because that would be reductive and silly. But he says the icy wind of death blows through what we do. And that our own emotional problems, our own traumas, our own vulnerabilities, our own anxieties, the grave and constant human sufferings, as Joyce would say it, can really work through us in a way that compels us to inflict this stuff on other people or the planet.
So some of the psychological forces at work in our society that draw us into war, that draw us into disregard for minorities and the weak. Those are the same forces at work in exploiting the environment.
Could be among the diversity of motives. There is that regurgitation of the self.
Jerry, thank you for an excellent conversation. This has been great. I hope you can come back and we'll do some more together.
Well, I'd love to, because I just got started.
Terrific. Thank you for watching and listening. Please join us next time.
Thank you for watching Here and Now. I'm Beth Lamont. Please join us next time here on MNN or visit us online and on Facebook.